Morning. Thanks for joining us today at Hudson Institute. My name is Michael Sobolik. I'm a senior fellow here. And today I have the true pleasure of bringing two friends of mine and also two preeminent scholars and experts in the China policy space. And both of them have been for a number of years now. So it's two people I've learned a lot from, two people I've looked up to for a long time. So what we are here today to talk about a person and the challenges and the themes that this individual brought to the forefront. This individual, Hu Yaobang, was at the epicenter of Chinese elite power struggles through the 70s, in the 80s, and culminated in his death. And we, as Americans, know a good bit about him, but may not be very familiar with his name, oddly enough. The reason we know a lot about Hu Yaobang is because his death was arguably the spark, the match that lit the flame of the protests at Tiananmen Square in 1989. Americans, by and large, know about Tiananmen, but what we don't know a lot about is what led up to that decisive moment in Chinese Communist Party politics. Bob, you have recently published a book, which we'll get into in a moment, but I think you framed it in some of your earlier conversations in a really intuitive way. You have already written a book about Tiananmen Square a number of years ago, but you've described the second book of yours, which we're going to talk about today, as the prequel to Tiananmen Square. And all of these conversations matter today, not just because the United States is in, whether you want to call it political warfare with the CCP, a new Cold War with the CCP. These conversations matter today because the Chinese Communist Party remains a very opaque political system. And when you're in a zero-sum existential tussle with your adversary, you need information, knowledge, and data about how your adversary operates, how their domestic politics work. And sometimes it's helpful to start small with an individual who's in the middle, the eye of that hurricane. And I think Hu Yaobang is perhaps one of the best individuals as a starting point to understand not only the history of CCP elite power politics, but what it means for us today in the era of Xi Jinping and in this very heated moment in US-China relations. So with that, I want to introduce our distinguished panel today. Bob Suettinger is someone I've come to know over the past decade in Washington. He and his better half, Diamond, have been a mainstay for me and a source of knowledge and wisdom on all of these issues with China and the party in particular. Bob has a really distinguished service in government as well. He retired from government in 1998 after nearly 25 years of public service in the intelligence, foreign policy bureaucracies. You spent several years at the CIA. You were at the NSC as well in a number of different roles. You worked with a number of different national security advisors during the 90s. But the reason you're here with us today is your most recent book, The Conscience of the Party, Hu Yaobang, China's Communist Reformer. And then to Bob's left, we have another good friend of mine, Piero Tozzi. Did I get the Italian last name right?
Tozzi, and a little bit of a hand gesture too, I think.
Tozzi. Yeah. I'll try to get my Norwegian Czech heritage in there.
Tozzi. Okay, there we go.
Piero is currently the Deputy Staff Director of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. You've previously been the Republican Staff Director at the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. You were the Staff Director, Counsel at the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights International Organizations. You received your JD from Fordham, your BA from Columbia. Both Bob and Piero are fluent in Mandarin, and you are also the author of several works on international law and others. So with that table setting, I've been looking forward to this conversation, so let's dive in. Bob, I find the title of your book challenging in a way because conscience and reform are words that I typically do not associate with the external picture that the Chinese Communist Party portrays to the world. And yet we know from the CCP's own history that the concept of reform is this open debate that has been raging since the days of Mao. But this word conscience is maybe wrongly, but to me I find it striking. When you use the word conscience for a party as Leninist, brutal at times as the CCP, what is it about Hu Yaobang and his life, his legacy, his leadership in the CCP? How does conscience fit in to the work that you did examining this man's life?
It's a good question and an interesting one. You're quite correct that the notion of conscience is not often associated with the Communist Party of China. The reason I took it for the book, actually my editor chose it, was because a man named Tian Jiyun, who was a vice premier and was well regarded as a reformist in the 80s and early 90s, wrote an article about Hu Yaobang in which he said he is the conscience of communists. And he used the term liangxin, which is usually translated conscience. The term liang means good, and when you put it together with two other words that sound much the same, liangzhi and liangzhi, it means either a sense of right and wrong, or it means wisdom. So the notion of somebody being a conscience is really a personal judgment about that person's intellect and about his abilities. The idea of conscience, of course, has a long history in Chinese, as it does in the language, and conscience is valued. The ability to decide what's the right course and the wrong course is the determining factor for many emperors' reputations later. In the case of the Communist Party, conscience was not what really what matters. In fact, conscience has been written about by some relatively liberal Chinese scholars as being the one thing that the Communist Party really lacks, and that conscience is an impediment to being a successful communist. We talk about the qualities that make for a success within the Communist Party, and conscience is not one of them. The ability to stab somebody in the back, metaphorically, the ability to pull a little trick on everybody, the ability to reach for power and grasp it. Those are all the elements of Communist Party culture that are prized and usually result in the success. And most of the people that you see reaching the top of the Communist Party are well known for their kind of lack of those human cultural traits that Hu Yaobang was known for. Hu Yaobang was a man of the people. He was born as a peasant in Hunan province. He was short, and not quite 5 feet tall. He was skinny, and not maybe a little over 100 pounds. So when you talk about somebody being small, he started out small and stayed that way. So that was an impediment for him, but also one of his centralizing foci. He said often and regularly in many places, if you lose the support of the people, then you're going to fall. And he consistently hammered on that theme, whether he was in Beijing or elsewhere. He said the people are the most important thing. Whether you're in a struggle or whether you're making policy, you have to keep in mind that the Laobaixing, the ordinary people of China, are really the focal point of what we should be doing, and we should never forget that. Well, unfortunately, the party has forgotten that, and fairly often. So the notion that culture has kind of faded from the scene with Xi Jinping and with some of his predecessors is certainly relevant to our understanding of that system.
Fascinating. Before the event began, Piero, you and I were talking, and you mentioned that you had some reflections on this question of reform, and I've been curious since that quick aside to hear what you had.
Right, and conscience. There was a saying about a certain American politician who will remain nameless, but I think it also apply here. The good thing about Hu Yaobang is he always wrestled with his conscience. The bad thing is that his conscience always lost. And that's not entirely fair, but the system is a horrible system. And the fact of the matter is that with its ups and downs, he still was a party man. And it is, and I think we can talk about, and reading Bob's book is quite fascinating because there are a number of inflection points in Hu Yaobang's career, and one very early during the Jiangxi period, Jiangxi Soviet in the 1930s, before the Long March, if people are familiar with that. There was this anti-Bolshevik purge, killed 10,000, and how old was he? 15 years old, 16? And he was almost killed at that time, and that probably did make a impression on him. But we see a number of times in his book where he does try to do better. But at the end of the day, I think he fails in a number of regards, though he does try to rectify things. I think we had a little text with, I see Nina Shea in the audience, and the great Nina Shea, who writes about religious freedom, and how is, conscience often is associated with religious freedom. Well, Hu Yaobang, when he did come back to power after being purged during the Cultural Revolution, did try to ameliorate the situation with the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, where religion is intertwined with their ethnic identity. But ultimately, he failed in that as well, and I think, Bob certainly can elaborate on that. But yes, he was, in some ways, you mentioned Xi Jinping. It is relative. You do have people that are better. Li Keqiang, the former premier, was seen as a rival to Xi Jinping. And the last public speech that he made an appeal to heaven and to the people. In Chinese, Ren Zai Gan, Tian Zai Kan, men act and heaven watches. And if you listen to the Chinese internet, there's a lot of speculation as to why he and how he met his demise. He did try to challenge the system, and maybe those with a modicum of conscience that do try to ameliorate ultimately fail because the system itself is rotten and evil, really.
This, again, maybe not entirely fair to Hu, but wrestling with conscience and losing, I think to the parts of your book, Bob, that were striking to me were understanding the fights that he actually did try to take on within the party. And I understand so much better after reading your book why Hu met the kind of opposition that he did. It takes a lot of political capital in a system like the CCP to reverse political sentences against thousands and thousands of people that came either directly or indirectly from Mao during the Cultural Revolution. And that also helped me better understand why he was so endeared to the people. It was at least one instance of him actually putting the interests of the people first. But that leads me to this broader question, which is, what was his actual agenda? If he had a conscience, and he at least made an effort to wrestle with it and to see what the party needed to do for the people, what was his agenda of reform? What did it actually look like? What was he trying to do?
Well, Hu Yaobang had a different approach to reform than either Deng or Zhao Ziyang, who is both of whom are well known as reformers. Deng's idea of reform was, let's get rich, let's bring in some foreign assistance and a lot of foreign money to do that. Zhao Ziyang had a more refined approach to it in terms of let's do various policies that are associated with reform. Hu Yaobang's idea of reform started at a very basic level, and it was, let's reform the party first, let's reform our ideology and get rid of some of the extreme Maoism that has been such a bane to our party's success. He had sort of four ideas about what should be done to reform party struggle. Struggle is a part of the Communist Party. It is political struggle for power. It's always been there. It always will be there. It never goes away. And Hu Yaobang said, well, at least we can make it a little bit more civilized. And so he had four no's. No beating with sticks. That's fairly obvious. No putting on hats which means no labeling of somebody as a counter-revolutionary or an anti-Marxist element or whatever. The third one was no seizing on pigtails, which is that just because somebody has a pigtail doesn't mean you have to pull it. In other words, don't look for idiosyncrasies or personality traits that you can blow out of proportion and criticize them. Fourth one was one that he added himself, which is don't bring a dossier bag to the meeting. And that was a reflection of the amount of secret information that was collected by the party against anybody and everybody. And they did this just hundreds of thousands of people. You can't bring that stuff into a struggle session. You can't bring that into a criticism session and say, if you only knew what I know, you'd know that this man is a counter-revolutionary. And Hu Yaobang said, that is wrong. It's not effective, and we shouldn't be doing it anymore. So he had ideas about reform that also applied to the larger party. And he said, basically, you're going to make mistakes. If you make a mistake, own up to it. Admit it. If you can, apologize for it. Correct it. Don't hold the person that called it into your attention. Don't attack that person, and don't make the mistake again. Atone for it. So this is a completely different perspective on how to deal with issues within the Communist Party than anybody else had. And he raised this first at a meeting in 1983, and it almost got him fired. I mean, the old conservatives could take the twitchiness and the shortness and the high squeaky voice and so forth and the Hunan accent, but once you start talking about apologizing for your mistakes, that's beyond the pale. So Hu Yaobang had, and even Deng didn't much like the idea, but Hu Yaobang had some other assets and contributions that we'll get to in a minute in a subsequent session. So he was never without opponents. He was never without people who were trying to bring him down. And oftentimes these people were in very high places.
Feel free to respond to any of that. But
well, just one thing on the dossier bag, and one thing that I think is very, again, in Bob's book, the role of Kang Sheng, the head of the state security, when he came back from Moscow, and Mao quickly saw in him someone, I guess, of a cold-hearted kindred spirit, and a tool that he could use in purging people. But one of the people I think that was targeted was Hu Yaobang's wife. And one thing, and I think this also speaks well of Hu Yaobang, is they had a long-standing marriage and a relationship, and that comes out in Bob's book as well. At a time, if you look at someone like Mao and other top Communist Party officials who went through mistresses and use of people. But I wonder to what extent that very personal experience, again, because it does seem to be at certain points in his career where he was touched very personally by sort of the harshness of the system, and whether that influenced his conscience, which he did really seem to have a sense of human-heartedness there, which was often lacking in Communist Party officials. So.
Just a sidebar on that, and that is an interesting thing that I've never been able to explain, is that the Ministry of State Security was established in 1983, when Hu Yaobang was pretty much at the height of his power. I cannot find one single reference in any of his biographic materials that he was at all involved in this establishment of the MSS. There's no word of it. Certainly he was interested in it, certainly he had opinions about it, and certainly he had opinions about Kang Sheng, but he is not known to have made any contribution to the establishment of that organization, which is, as I say, interesting but unexplainable.
Wow. You said something, Bob, that I want to pull a thread on. You talked about that not only, like, Hu was not the only one that had opinions on reform during his time. You mentioned Deng, you mentioned Zhao Ziyang as well. And I want to talk about Deng Xiaoping for just a moment here, because the reputation that Deng widely enjoys in the United States and among people that have some passing understanding of China, Deng Xiaoping is the great reformer. He is the one that guided the party's transition away from the tumultuous reign of Mao during the Cultural Revolution and previously the Great Leap Forward. He was the one that brought some structure, supposedly some sort of shared leadership eventually as his time went on. But Bob, you are, I think in a way, maybe challenging some of that perspective about Deng, where if his primary method of reform was to get in a lot of foreign capital, that actually has been quite successful for the CCP over the past few decades because we have fallen for that bait consistently. But I wonder if you could say a little more about how, and if you reject the premise of this question, that's equally fine too. But I wonder if we misunderstand Deng Xiaoping and maybe attribute some reform ideas to him that maybe were not his.
Well, a couple of points on it. Yes, I think that's a correct question. Deng Xiaoping was often considered to be Hu Yaobang's mentor, or Hu Yaobang was considered to be his protege. Their relationship went back to the late 1940s when they were both in the southwestern part of China. Deng Xiaoping was the regional party secretary for the Southwest, which included Sichuan, Guizhou, Yunnan, and Xikang. And Hu Yaobang was put in charge of one part of Sichuan province, North Sichuan province. It was an area of about 17 million people, so it's not a small area. But he was appointed by Mao, and Deng they had heard of each other, but they didn't know each other. They got to know each other quite well in the 2 years that they were together in that area. Deng Xiaoping was hard man. Mao Zedong called for a lot of violence in that early period from 1950 to 1952. And there were hundreds of thousands of people in the Southwest that were killed as a result of various campaigns against counter-revolutionaries, against landlords, and so forth. And Hu Yaobang was tasked with carrying them out. Subsequently, he was criticized for not killing enough people, but it was a charge that he refuted because he did kill a lot of people. But it was nowhere near what his counterparts did in the other 4 areas of Sichuan, and certainly not in places like Guizhou. Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang played bridge together fairly often. They both enjoyed the game. They both enjoyed playing against each other and not with each other, because Hu Yaobang and Deng Xiaoping did not use the same conventions, nor did they have the same kind of method of play. Hu Yaobang was a lot more excitable. Deng Xiaoping was a man of action. He was one of those guys that said, let's do something. And he was very famous. There was a Chinese phrase that describes it, which is translated, he didn't read books and he didn't read newspapers. 不读书,不看报. And Hu Yaobang was pretty much the opposite. Although he was a poor peasant, he only got to the 7th grade, essentially, in his education, then went up and joined the revolution in Jiangxi. But he read, incessantly, always had a book in his hand, and he read everything. So he was familiar with intellectual history, with Chinese history, very knowledgeable about things, and he did know about these theories and so forth. He did read. He read the works of Marx and Lenin and Engels. He even read Engels, and learned from them. Could recite them. He never advertised how much he read the works of Mao Zedong, but clearly he had to do that. So when it came to questions of reform and opening, 改革开放, Hu Yaobang had a better idea of what was involved in that than Deng did. But Deng got the credit. Why? Because one, his rank was higher, and two, he was much more open to the foreign press. Deng Xiaoping had a knack for, if he was running into headwinds in some of his policy discussions, he'd have a meeting with a foreign journalist. And that journalist would write an article. The article would then be picked up by the Cancao Xiaoxi, which is the Chinese means of communicating with all the cadres. It didn't go through the propaganda department. It didn't go through the general secretary. It just went out there because Deng Xiaoping said it. So he would get his ideas out that way. And in 1978, before the party plenum, that sort of set reform and opening as the guideline for their work, and set, in improving the economy rather than class struggle as the means by which the party would accomplish things. Deng was the champion. Did he have any idea what it meant? Not really. But Hu Yaobang did, and he then took Deng's ideas, spun them out, and instructed other members of the party as to how to go about carrying out reform and opening. So he was in many ways more effective than Deng was in terms of coming up with policies. Deng was more successful with reform and opening after 1989. He kind of receded to the second line for a period of time, and Jiang Zemin was talking with Chen Yun about economic policy, and it was all going south. And then Deng went south and started talking about the need to get back on the reform and opening kick. And he basically sort of went in front of Jiang Zemin and said, "You either will go back to reform and opening, or you're going to have another job." And although Deng wasn't the figure that he was in 1989, Jiang got the message, and he got on board. And all the policies about special economic zones and all these other things were some of them were Hu Yaobang's ideas, some of them were Wang Li's, but most of them were not Deng's. But he happily adopted them because they were popular, and that's where Deng got his reputation as being a reformer. He basically took ideas from others and put them into effect because that's what he was good at.
I think one thing about your question, it underscores how often we get China wrong, we get our foreign policy wrong, is because we see what we want to see. We identify, oh, Deng's a reformer, and we think we know what that means. It's a bit of a Rorschach test for our foreign policy elites. And I think there have been a number of points throughout our engagement with China. I mean, dating back to George Marshall and 1946, forcing a united front between the Kuomintang and the CCP. But we oftentimes have these ideas. We think of Deng relating to Gorbachev, and Gorbachev still wanted to retain the communist system. We forget that he failed because of he was overwhelmed by circumstances. But at the root, these people are still communists, and they're Chinese communists, which means they have this legalist Fajia legacy as well that runs in their DNA. And people get that wrong, and we don't often take them at their word. We just hear what we want to hear. Reporters report, what they have in their mind. But there are a number of books that I think illustrate kind of how China sees the world, not how we see and how we transpose our own ideas on them. There was a book written by two PLA colonels in, I think, the late 90s, 1999 or so, Colonels Wang and Chao, Unrestricted Warfare. And it is a template, really, for how China approaches this, not an economic rivalry, not an even strategic rivalry, but a systemic one, where they want to overturn, really, the entire post-war rules-based order. Another important book, and these are available in English, Wang Huning, America Against America. Wang Huning is the brain, really, of a succession of Chinese leaders dating back to Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. Incredible survivability. But he also very clear, and he's also the person who's in charge of the policy towards Taiwan as well. So very important to kind of understand what is he thinking. Yeah, you can read all your Xi Jinping thought or whatnot, but really it's, I think, Wang Huning there. So that I think is it's an important point that we often lose sight of.
I've been spending some time reading America Against America recently, and maybe we'll have a separate conversation on that one day because we easily could. This concept of mirror imaging or confirmation bias that, right, Piero, you're talking about, seeing what you want to see, not only because maybe many Western reporters, pundits, commentary folks lack the requisite understanding of the system to actually see it for what it is. But I think it's also human nature this was a common theme during the Cold War with the Soviets, mirror imaging our philosophy and frankly, our ideology of nuclear weapons and our theory of deterrence onto them. Like this is a perennial problem in politics. And one of my favorite parts of your book, Bob, is how you challenge Western understandings of the party by actually laying out a rubric of what power looks like in the CCP. And I think this might be a good bridge from this conversation about Hu Yaobang into this second part of our conversation, which will focus maybe more on CCP elite politics today. There's a lot of commentary out there that says as long as, whether it's Mao or Xi Jinping or others, as long as they have the big three titles, as long as they are the General Secretary of the party, Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and top dog in PRC, like as long as they have those three things, then this is the person, unchallenged, they are in the driver's seat, they are ruling the party. You have interesting characters like Deng who were in the shadows and maybe didn't hold particular offices, but were still paramount in their own way. But a lot of the reporting about Xi Jinping today is he's got all three. Clearly, he's the main dude who is unchallenged. You talk about 4 power centers inside of China in your book to understand the party on its own merits for how one retains and exercises power in this opaque system. Talk to us for a moment about those 4 pillars of power inside of the party and how it works.
Okay, I will do that, and I have to give my footnote in advance here. My wife, Diamond Liu, has been very instrumental in my thinking about this issue. I have always believed that power was the chief driver of politics in China. China's system, we have a tendency to simplify it. And this is a country of 1.4 billion. It has provinces that have over 100 million people in them. It's extraordinarily complex. It's not easy to run. You have to have massive bureaucracies to do your bidding. One person can't stand up on the stage and say, well, I called my friend out in Sichuan and I told him to shoot that guy out in, Mao could do that, but Xi Jinping can't. It is a system that is often in struggle with itself. These are people that are not all chosen by the same leader. They arise from provincial areas that are different, speak different dialects, have different culture, different food, different politics in many ways. Very complicated. Money matters, personalities matter, issues maybe a little bit, but not as much as what's called guanxi, which is the ability to have relationships with other people who matter. So who did you grow up with? Where did you go to school? Were you in the military unit with this person? And those kinds of relationships last over time. They lead to factionalism. But factionalism is a crime in China. You can't be in a faction. So they call them chuer, or circles. And so they're basically friendships. I wrote an article a long time ago when I was at the CIA about factionalism in China. And I'm not going to bother bore you with it here. But the fact of the matter is that despite everybody's claim, factionalism does exist in China, and it's lethal. Interpersonal power struggles usually develop rather slowly. If you look at Mao versus Liu Shaoqi, for example, they started hating each other back in Yan'an, but they didn't really kind of get down to loggerheads until the 50s, when they began to disagree on policy issues and personalities. Liu Shaoqi's wife was much prettier than Mao's, but that's another story altogether. But they began to be serious, and the thing about these political issues is that they get personalized, and they develop into hatreds. And by the early 1960s, after the disasters of Mao's Great Leap Forward, after the firing of his defense minister, which was also a personal battle, Liu Shaoqi was sort of put in charge while Mao went gallivanting around the South. But Mao decided as early as 1962 that Liu Shaoqi had to go. Well, he didn't go for another 4 years, and it developed very slowly. Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun had a similar relationship, but not quite as hostile. Deng Xiaoping respected Chen Yun, although I'm not sure why, because Chen Yun's economic expertise was way overrated. But Chen Yun had seniority on Deng. He joined the Politburo Standing Committee before Deng did. So Deng always, when they were in conflict with each other, he always backed away and said, we'll do it your way. And most people don't understand that competition even existed, much less that Deng gave way on it for so often. If you think Xi Jinping is without enemies and people who would like to bump him off, that would be wrong. We don't see this stuff because we don't read the material. We don't read the tea leaves. We don't read the body language. We don't read the diaspora media, for one thing, which is full of this stuff and has been. I mean, I started reading that stuff when it was published in Hong Kong in the 1970s. They had wonderful stories about backroom politics in the PRC. Do you think those are wrong? Well, they can't be proven, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. And the fact of the matter is, these guys aren't good friends. They don't like each other. And many of them consider themselves to be ideological opponents, personal opponents, or otherwise hostile to these people that are kind of running up the back of their feet in order to get ahead. There's always competition for power. So when you talk about the power game in China, that's one thing. But the Communist Party does not want foreigners to know about it. More importantly, they don't want their own people to know about it. Because as you may recall from 1989, when people in the streets began to understand that there was a real power struggle going on between Li Peng and Zhao Ziyang, boy, they started getting involved in a big way. And it almost got out of control. It did get out of control. And it took the PLA to put it back under control with violence. So it goes without saying that if you ask people who don't know much about the political system, what's going on in Beijing under Xi Jinping, they're going to say Xi is large and in charge. And that's the end of the argument. They don't do any research. They don't do any interpretation. They don't look for signs, which may be very subtle, but you have to pay attention to the signs. The details matter. The people in the sub-bureaucratic level, the deputy head of the organization department, not the head of the organization, but the deputy is really important in terms of who actually gets stuff done. Xi Jinping is the chairman of the military commission. Do you think he calls down to the Southern Theater Command and says, I want you to fire this guy, or I want you to hire that guy? No, that isn't how the PLA works. You know, the PLA is a large bureaucracy of very proud and distinguished individuals who are mostly corrupt, but into old boy networks in a big way. And they don't just take orders, they have to go through the proper channels. So things work differently in China than we think they work. So when people are saying, oh, this person got purged, why is Xi Jinping purging the people that he brought into office? Yeah. Well, the fact of the matter is he probably is not. But somebody is, and what we don't know is who it is and how they're going about it. So there's lots to learn. There's lots to study about this system, and it really is important for people to, one, read the Chinese because they aren't publishing all that much in English lately, but also to sort of branch out a little bit and listen for different opinions about what's going on, because you're surprised what you'll find out doing so. Sorry, went on long.
Yeah, it's interesting how we've really gotten Xi Jinping wrong from the inception. And if you look at the confirmation bias, early on, 2012 or so, Xi Jinping as an anti-corruption reformer, there's this word and phrase in Chinese, fa zhi, which often is translated as rule of law. It also means rule by law. And in the Xi Jinping context, that really is what it meant. You had rivals like Bo Xilai and the anti-corruption charges that were brought against him and his wife, and people point to that. The whole system is corrupt. Xi Jinping and his family is corrupt. It's often through his sister and her husband, is how they squirrel away the money. Anti-corruption is a tool that is used against one's enemies. And that very much relates to the current ideas about purges and who's doing the purges. I think there is learned speculation, if you look at the Central Military Commission, that Xi Jinping and Zhang Youxia are like scorpions in a bottle. And to Bob's point, when you have people like Miao Hua and Hu Yaobang, who were clearly Xi Jinping's people on the Central Military Commission, and they disappear, and they're also the people with the Eastern Theater Command in Fujian. You know, Xi Jinping's, one of his power bases was Fujian. That's how he rose. They're also the people that, if there were an invasion of Taiwan, you know, that would be the Eastern Theater Command. Well, they've been eliminated now. So what does that portend? What does that say? And, you know, there is this common theme that, you know, she's large and in charge. And we also hear in Taiwan from the Mainland Affairs Commission. That's the theme that they stress. And you ask the question, well, what about Zhang Youxia? If she really is fully in power, why is Zhang Youxia still there? And that's, I think, an open question. And to Bob's point, if you do read the diaspora media, there's a lot of rumors, and it's hard to sift through. But you got to read it. Everything is an intelligence source. You know, when I used to do Africa issues and, you know, the Horn of Africa, you get into a cab, and this is pre-COVID when people took cabs and not Uber or whatnot. Chances were your cab driver was from Ethiopia. That was an intelligence source. You find out, are you Amhara, are you Oromo, are you Tigrayan? There's a lot that you can learn, sort of man-in-the-street intelligence. And I don't think we take full advantage of that. And many of the China watchers, they'll disparage something that comes from, say, the Falun Gong, which a lot of the non-state-controlled media is here. There are problems with it, but you do have to consider it and weigh it. And you have to factor it in. And you know, you don't take anything really for granted. I mean, I like the Real Clear Politics approach, where they have you know, with their webpage, they'll have left article, right article, and you have to read everything, and you have to weigh everything and discount certain things. But you know, I think there's a lot more that can be done to shape our understanding of the current leadership struggles in China. And you know, I think the point also one gets from reading Bob's book is how much these people hated each other. I mean, it really it is something that again, it's ingrained in the system. It really is an evil system, and it's ruthless there. So yeah, no, I think that's something that we tend to overlook, and we tend to sugarcoat that aspect of it.
Let me just add one point here, which is really another one of your questions about Xi Jinping. Hu Yaobang's point that people need to pay attention to the Laobaixing, to the ordinary people and their complaints. The ordinary people have been suffering under Xi Jinping. If you look at his policies, they have been disastrous for ordinary people in China. They may look good for the tech sector. They may look good in some of the urban areas, although even that is not working. But if you look at foreign policy, there's a lot of people in China that really dislike Russia and don't like having a relationship with North Korea. There are a lot of people that were entrepreneurs that have lost their businesses because of Xi Jinping's failure to provide the kind of support for entrepreneurs that used to be done. There are a lot of people in mourning for their parents and their grandparents who died during the COVID thing and the lockdowns and so forth. There are a lot of people who think that the real estate market was artificially inflated by the government, and Xi Jinping is getting blamed for that. So what do you do when you're being blamed for everything under the sun? You start purging people, and you start blaming people, because certainly the man in charge isn't going to take the blame. But some of those elders that are kind of lurking around in the background that we hear from occasionally people who used to be in the Politburo Standing Committee, they're saying it's Xi Jinping's fault. You need to get rid of that guy. So that's where the turmoil is coming from, is from the policy failures. And there's no question of the fact that Xi Jinping is responsible for many of those failures simply because of the way he organized things. He was the chairman of everything. If he didn't have a working group for it, he'd have a commission. He was the head of the commission. Did he do all the work? No, of course not. But the bureaucracy didn't run any more smoothly just because she was in charge. So there were a lot of mistakes made. And Xi Jinping is never going to own up to any of those. So that's where a lot of the problem is coming from.
Yeah.
We've been talking about power and struggle in Hu Yaobang's day and Xi Jinping's day today. What we haven't really talked about today yet are these two words that have permeated this whole conversation in your book, Bob: conscience and reform. I was listening today to a conversation you had a few months ago with Radio Free Asia, and you said something that struck me. You described Hu Yaobang as an honorable man, but then you said, will the party let that kind of man rise to the top today? So let me pose that question to you. When we talk about a reformer like Hu Yaobang and a man of conscience like Hu Yaobang, does the CCP, is it in a state where someone like that has a shot, a good faith shot at pushing an actual reform agenda within the party today, which I suppose actually presumes another question: is the party actually reformable from within?
Well, an excellent question, and I will only add a couple of data points. I used a website called the Hu Yaobang Information website, and I used it extensively. I had something like 400 footnotes that went back to that site. And just as I went into my galley proofs, they closed it. And so I had to add them into a website and so forth and make them available to people, simply because otherwise I had 450 dead footnotes. And to my amazement, in August, it reopened with all the same URLs. They didn't change them. So all those articles that I footnoted are back online on this Hu Yaobang website. Hu Yaobang's name has been kind of back into the verboten territory, but his son, who established this website, was a player, according to the diaspora media, in some of the struggles that were going on between Xi Jinping and his opponents. Reform and opening has come back. It's being mentioned. It's being talked about, even in the military. Is it actually going to become a new trend under Xi Jinping? We'll have to wait and see on that. We've got a fourth plenum coming up in October. They will decide how things are going to go, both in terms of personnel and in terms of policies. It's all up for grabs. Xi Jinping is still large, and he's still in charge, and he is going to be heard from. And he's being heard from because he controls the propaganda apparatus, one of the four pillars that we talked about before. And his message, even though he's not being called the core as often, his message is still getting out. In fact, today there were a couple of blasts that are going to make people unhappy. There is a person who has been brought back, who was the object of Xi Jinping's wrath at the 20th Party Congress when he scratched his name off the promotion list. Hu Jintao wanted to see it. They kicked him out. Is a fellow named, ironically, Hu Chuanhua. Hu Chuanhua is in some ways similar to Hu Yaobang. He was involved in the China Youth League. He was born as a peasant. He came up through the ranks. He spent 20 years in Tibet as a party cadre before he came to the attention of Hu Jintao. And since then, his rise has been rather meteoric. Since the 20th Congress, he's been a non-person, a member of the Chinese People's Consultative Congress, but not in any way a power person. But he is now back. He was on when Xi Jinping went out to Tibet. Hu Chuanhua was on the delegation. Why? And so you have to look for these little tiny. The new head of the organization department came out of the China Youth League. Other people who are rising within the Xi administration have this youth league as part of their backgrounds. That wasn't happening back 5 years ago. So something is afoot. There are changes that are being made. We don't know what they're going to eventuate in. There are lots of rumors, and we simply are going to have to wait and see, keep our eyes open and our ears open, because Xi Jinping matters. He's done a lot of stuff that is impactful, that have been not in our interests and not in his own people's interests, and a lot of people know that. So is he gonna be bad and continue to have all these power channels henceforth? We'll wait and see. It's an interesting question, and it really is going to be decisive, I think, for China's future. Xi Jinping may turn out to be the last of the general secretaries of the Communist Party if things go wrong. But he's still in power, and it's still an open debate.
Piero, if you have any brief thoughts, share them, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Sure. I think, after Tiananmen, the Chinese Communist Party made this grand bargain with the Chinese people. You give us power and don't challenge that, and we'll make you prosperous. Xi Jinping broke that. They neither have, it's a repressive regime, but also it's economically stagnant, and that has impacted the people. There was someone, I think, who was a reformer, Li Keqiang, the former premier. He was on the economics. He wanted to reform the economy. He also stood up for small vendors. Xi Jinping wanted to eliminate that and Li Keqiang was a champion of the small food stalls and things like that. Li Keqiang, again, that final speech that he made, public speech, where he said that heaven, men act and heaven watches. Why that was so interpreted, I think, by Xi Jinping and as a challenge, is because it echoes this saying that Mencius, and it's in the Book of Documents, that heaven sees with the eyes of the people and hears with the ears of the people, and that's also where Mencius, talks about the mandate of heaven, the right to rule, the moral legitimacy there to rule, and Mencius is. The question is posed, is it ever right to overthrow a government and to overthrow a king? And he says no, because a government and a king implies legitimacy, but it is right to overthrow a tyrant and to overthrow a tyranny. And that, in this kind of, I think, when you unpack that was the message, that Xi Jinping is acting tyrannically, he's oppressing the people. And that was a challenge, and in many ways, to kind of circle back to this idea of conscience and conscience of the party, despite it all, there probably is this residual, whether it's a Confucian sense of an appeal to heaven or a law above the law, or the Tao, by which you can judge the actions of men. So in some ways, but again, I think the system itself is rotten to the core. Can a few good men change that? Can a Hu Yaobang, can a Li Keqiang? I think ultimately the answer to that is no.
Well, with the 5 or so minutes we have remaining, we'll open it up for audience Q&A. We'll probably have time for 1-2 questions tops. I see a hand right here in the aisle. When you have a microphone come to you, if you could please state your name and your affiliation, and questions, no statements, please.
Yeah, thank you. Klaus Lares. I used to be at the Wilson Center and UNC Chapel Hill. Now I'm only at UNC Chapel Hill. I very much enjoyed the conversation. If Xi Jinping is as controversial and as unpopular domestically and within the party, how did he manage to get a 3rd term in office, change the constitution, and will probably get a 4th term in office? Thank you.
The easy answer to that is he cheated. He rewrote the ballots without the majority of the people in the Central Committee knowing what he was doing. Zhang Youxia knew, apparently, and approved of it, and a couple of other people went along. And so they were able to change the ballot. When Hu Jintao noticed that something was amiss and wanted to look at it, they booted him out of the meeting. And everybody, as you may remember, the scene was very visually arresting. As Hu Jintao was being escorted from the meeting by Xi Jinping's own guard, the rest of them sat there like they'd been poleaxed. I mean, they didn't know what to do, they didn't know what to say, and they all remained silent. Some of them have made their statements since that time, saying that they didn't agree with it, but there was nothing that they could do. So that's an indicator in some ways of the power that the chairman has, or I'm sorry, not the chairman, the general secretary has. And it's still, that part is still in Xi Jinping's hands. The final documents at the 4th plenum, the final documents at the 21st Congress, if Xi Jinping is still general secretary at that point, will be his to approve. So he still has a lot going for him. But the approval of the people, not so much. The approval of the elders, maybe not so much. The approval of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, he's still got. And we'll see how that works out.
Yeah, I think one difference too is that Zhang Youxia had backed him at that time, and that's something that may have changed. And one thing I just wanted, because I think it's important, you mentioned that he was able to amend the Constitution. We use phrases like Constitution, Xianfa, and we think of it as our own Constitution. It really isn't. It's a party platform. And each general secretary is able to sort of reshape it. But that goes to this idea that we think in terms of rule of law, like you have a system like ours, and we don't. It's ultimately, I mean, if you want to talk about the Constitution, quote unquote, it's ultimately it's the Communist Party that's in power. And ultimately, I think when you want to even go beyond that, it's, as Mao Zedong famously said, that power flows from the barrel of the gun. It really, and the PLA, it's not a national army, it's a party army, and it probably reflects the divisions and factions, even though factions is an illegal term, or factions are illegal, different factions within the Communist Party itself. But ultimately, all this, it underscores that it is the Communist Party that's in control. Law is used as rule by law. And right now, things are probably, I still think, a little bit opaque. The final chapter is yet to be written.
So we'll do another question over here. It's second row.
Thank you. Thank you both. One of the narratives I really enjoyed in the book was the theme of organizational factionalism. And one of the themes is, the Hu at the party school competing against, the leftists in the propaganda department. Hu and Hu Qiaomu when they rise to the propaganda department. How do you think that we should study modern factionalism within these organizations, or do you think that is something that we can mostly study through archival research or learn after the fact?
Interesting question. I don't think, because in the 80s, they were still recovering from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, and they were still putting the organizations and the other departments back together. And they were trying to, it was sort of helter-skelter. You can look at personnel appointments that were done by Deng in the 1980s, and you can almost divide them right in half and say, that part is pro-Deng, that part is pro-Chen Yun. I don't think that they are as sharply divided now, but they are divided. One of the things that I noted when the 20th Party Congress was held was that Xi Jinping brought his people into the top. At this, there were 3 people that were left over, or 2 or 3 people left over from the earlier standing committee. But Xi Jinping brought his people in, to make sure that he would be able to prevail. If there ever came to a vote, it would be, at least 4-3 in terms of Xi Jinping. We can look at the current situation and see some divisions within the propaganda apparatus, but you can't, mail those home. You can't stand on a soapbox and say, I know this to be true. because they're interpretive. You know, it's reading nuance. It's reading who's who and standing in this line or that line. It's reading body language when somebody's standing in front of Xi Jinping with his hands in front of him folded neatly, or standing with his hands behind him. It makes a difference as to how he's looking at Xi Jinping. Why would you think that? Well, it happens to be true. And these are the kinds of things that we have to watch for when we're interpreting how things are going. It seems to me very obvious that with the amount of information out on the diaspora networks that is highly critical of Xi Jinping, with the apparent reliability of some of the information that they're providing, there's leaks in that system. We don't know who they are. We don't know how they operate, but they're there, and that information is becoming available outside of China, and some of it is obviously going back into China. So people know what's going on, whether they can quash it, whether they can stop all this nonsense and put Xi Jinping back on his throne, remains to be seen. I can't deny that it's possible. Is that what I would like to see? No, I wouldn't think so. But I don't vote the Communist Party, and neither does anybody else. But it's a complex system, and there are differences in it, and there always will be. And I don't think that the fourth plenum is going to be decisive in how the balance is reached. They'll find some medium ground where Xi's critics will be able to remain, but Xi himself may not be thrown out of office. Things don't work quite that way in the PRC.
Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. This conversation, I think, is leaving me with some lingering questions for policymakers, the kind of policymakers that, Bob, you would provide assessments for during your time in government, Piero, for the type of lawmakers that you staff and interact with every single day. If one of the most perennial and long-lasting challenges in foreign policy is to see the other, to see your adversary for who they actually are, not for who we want them to be, not for who we think they are, but actually on their own merits, then this conversation about Hu Yaobang is really more than just him as an individual. It's about understanding the Chinese Communist Party for what it is to the extent that we can. And I think, Bob, you've done a really compelling job of showing how difficult that is, how challenging it is with this kind of opaque system, but also how necessary it is. Because if there are opportunities, and if there are, in fact, divisions within the party, that's of interest, and that is of note for American policymakers, or at least it should be.
That's good.
With that, thank you for joining, thank you for your book, and thanks to each of you for coming to Hudson today. There is lunch outside.